what needs to be done. We haven't debated these issues, and sometimes we've gotten involved in wars that we have found are more complicated than originally thought. There's nothing wrong with debate. It is incredibly important, and in the People's House of Representatives, we ought to have a debate on this issue. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 2 minutes. The gentlewoman from Ohio is captain.
The gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for yielding to me, and also thank our ranking member of the Defense Subcommittee, Mr. Visklosky of Indiana, and our mutual friend and colleague, Chairman Bill Young of Florida, for their hard work on this bill. And that will benefit our nation, our men and women in uniform, our armed forces, and all of those who are touched by what is contained in this legislation. Within the limits provided, and despite severe cuts, this bill has been written in a bipartisan way by our subcommittee. I thank the members for working so collaboratively together. It is a model for this House and our committee on how to do the work necessary to meet the needs of the American people. The bill includes $125 million above the President's request for funding health research for traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress conditions, the signature wounds of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The bill also includes $544 million for cancer research, including breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, and lung cancer research that are endured at a much higher percentage among our troops and the population at large. The bill also contains continuing support for our NATO responsibilities, including continuing joint operations related to the newly independent states. The bill includes the requested amount in the budget for the Iron Dome Missile Defense Partnership with Israel, and the bill also includes $1.5 billion above the request for the National Guard and Reserve Equipment account to fund equipment requirements of the National Guard and Reserve components. During the last decade of war, our National Guard and Reserve units have proven themselves as strategic partners for our nation. Our subcommittee continues to provide the funding necessary for our Guard and Reserve units to continue their missions, which they do extremely well and much more cost-effectively than in the active forces. This legislation also continues the military's commitment to lead our nation toward energy independence. The Pentagon, as the largest petroleum user in the world, must lead our nation forward toward energy independence. No challenge could be more vital to our national security and economic security than energy independence. High fuel costs are an enormous burden on American families, and might I be yielded an additional 15 seconds?
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, Congressman McGovern. High fuel costs are an enormous burden on America's families and our military. It is also a burden on every branch of the service, where it costs us $400 a gallon to deliver 1 gallon of gasoline to the troops at the front line, fully costed. Thank you again to Chairman Bill Young, to Ranking Member Visklosky for their leadership, to our Ranking Member on the full committee, Mrs. Lowy of New York, and Chairman Rogers of Kentucky, for working with all our members to meet the needs of our nation, our Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, those who serve us every day so nobly. I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I just would like to comment on the gentlelady's comments as it relates from Ohio. I appreciate her comments and her support for the military, and with that I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to urge people to vote no on the previous question, and if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule that will allow the House to consider the Van Hollen resolution calling on Speaker Boehner to proceed to a conference on the budget. It is time for the majority to follow regular order by immediately appointing conferees to negotiate the 2014 budget conference agreement with the Senate. And to discuss that proposal, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished ranking member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Massachusetts. And I want at the outset to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. McGovern and Mr. Welch regarding the importance of this body having a debate and a vote on whether or not we should be sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to engage and support the rebels in the civil war in Syria. After all, this budget supports the Defense Department. It also supports the intelligence agency. So this is the time and place to have the debate about taxpayer dollars going into a civil war in Syria. It's also the time and high time that we get on with passing a federal budget. We've heard a lot of talk on the floor today about the importance of supporting our military. Absolutely true. But this legislation does nothing to turn off the sequester. So unless the Congress comes together on a bipartisan and bicameral basis to resolve the budget, this defense appropriations bill is going to be cut by about $48 billion, just as the non-defense parts of the budget will be cut as a result of sequestration. So I don't think the American people recognize that as of today, even though we're working on these spending bills, the United States Congress has not passed a budget. No federal budget in place today. Now, we heard a lot from our Republican colleagues over the last couple of years about how the Senate was derelict in its duty for not having a budget. Guess what? The Senate passed a budget. It passed a budget 122 days ago. Ever since that time, we've said to our Republican colleagues, let's take the next step in the process. Let's have a conference. Senate, House, get together to work out those differences. In fact, Senator Murray, who's the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, has asked now 17 times for unanimous consent in the Senate to begin negotiations. We have called upon the Speaker of the House to appoint conferees to negotiate on the budget. He has refused. This motion is very simple. I'm just going to read the resolve clause. It's the sense of the House of Representatives that the Speaker should follow regular House procedure and immediately request a conference and appoint conferees to negotiate the fiscal year 2014 budget resolution. Very simple. Calling for exactly what our Republican colleagues have called for the last 3 years. We heard from you many times, no budget, no pay. We don't have a budget. Members of Congress are getting paid. Now, Senator McCain and a lot of Republican senators have made the point that it's insane to not go to conference on the budget. Here's what he said, Senator McCain. I think it's insane for Republicans who complained for 4 years about Harry Reid not having a budget, and now we're not going to agree to conferees. That is beyond comprehension for me. That sentiment was seconded by lots of other Republican senators. In fact, I think my colleagues know I've heard from a lot of our House Republican colleagues quietly saying they're frankly embarrassed at the fact that the House Republicans have refused to appoint conferees and take the next step in the budget process. Why is it important? We got to get our economy moving in full gear. The Congressional Budget Office has told us that as a result of the sequester, we're going to have 700,000 fewer jobs in this country by the end of this calendar year, that it's going to reduce our economic growth by 1/3. The budget conference is where we work out our differences and try and remove the uncertainty in the economy. By not going to budget conference, let's be clear, what our Republican colleagues are doing, they want to take us right up to the cliff of government shutdown in the beginning of October, next fiscal year. They're talking about once again rolling the dice and playing a game of chicken as to whether or not the United States pays its bills on time. That is no way for the federal government to conduct itself. So I would ask my colleagues to put aside all the gamesmanship and simply today appoint conferees so that we can begin to work out these issues on the budget. Right now, as we head into the next school year, the kids of our soldiers who are at Fort Bragg are going to miss 5 days of school this fall because their teachers are sequestered. Their pay is because of the sequester, they're going to be furloughed for 5 days this fall. These are the kids of men and women fighting to defend this country. That is wrong. So let's get on with replacing the sequester in a smart way, but you can't do that unless we get on with the budget conference. So I ask my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can go to conference. I thank the Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's always great to hear from Mr. Van Hollen. He's been in front of the Rules Committee, I think, half a dozen times on this particular issue. But that's not the issue we're talking about today. Today we're talking about a rule to bring forward two bills, and one is the appropriations bill for the defense of this country. I appreciate his comments, but, you know, he also forgets to mention that in the last Congress, this House passed two pieces of legislation to actually do what he was talking about doing. And guess what? It went over to that place where they have rocking chairs where they do nothing. And they didn't discuss it, didn't debate it, didn't even send it back to us because they just didn't have the time to do it in their busy schedule. So I understand that. So I would be glad to yield just 30 seconds.
All right, just for look, as the gentleman knows, we're in a new Congress right now, and in the new Congress, the law requires that we pass a federal budget by April 15th. We're obviously way overdue. It's indisputed that the Senate's passed a budget. Why not go to conference?
Reclaiming my time, I mean, you know, you brought up about shutting the government down. That's your words, not ours. I don't think you've heard that at all from this side. You know, about not shutting the government down, it's about passing 12 appropriation bills. That's really what we're supposed to be doing, and we're committed to doing that. We don't want to see a government shutdown. That is the last thing, and I think by our intentions about bringing appropriation bills to this House shows, in fact, that that's not the intent, and that's not the desire. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to build on what my colleague, Mr. Van Hollen, was talking about, the reason why we're so frustrated over here is because it seems that the Republican leadership here is hell-bent on doing nothing, stopping everything. We have 16 legislative days left till the end of the fiscal year. You've only passed 3 appropriations bills. No conference on the budget. Notwithstanding the fact that the House passed a budget, the Senate passed a budget. We have a debt limit looming, which I hear rumors that you're trying to figure out, you know, what pound of flesh that you can obtain in order to avoid us defaulting on our financial obligations. This is not the way to run a government. And I would just plead with my colleagues on the other side that you need to get serious about sitting down and negotiating out differences. One of the things about a conference is you don't get everything you want and they don't get everything they want. But these appropriations bills that you are bringing to the floor, the allocations are so low that that they're unamendable on the House floor. And they would do great damage to our economy. This T-HUD bill, which I don't think will ever see the light of day, any more than I think the Ag-Approps bill, which we gave a rule to, will ever see the light of day. But that T-HUD bill, the cuts in the community development block grants, you have the program. You cut it in half. The devastation on cities all across this country, and communities all across this country, will be so bad. People are going to lose jobs. The gentleman from Maryland talked about the furloughs. People losing their jobs because of the sequester. And you sit back and say, oh, it's not our fault. This is the body that voted for it. I mean, the people in this House voted for, I didn't, but the majority of my friends on the other side voted for sequester. It is now the law of the land. That's part of what Congress did. Congress has to change the law so we get our economy back on the right track. And one way to begin is to do what you're supposed to do and go to conference with the Senate on the budget. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Chair, remind all members of the House essential rule of decorum in the House. Under Clause 1 of Rule 17, members are to direct their remarks to the Chair and not to other members in the second person. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I reserve.
Florida reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
May I ask the gentleman how many more speakers he has?
I have none.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 3.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Florida has 16 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have a problem with what's in this rule. I have a problem with what's been left out of the rule. We have some serious issues to discuss. The NSA surveillance program, limited debate in this rule. We need to talk about Syria, whether we're going to get sucked into another war. Multiple amendments were offered. All of them were denied except one that basically reinstates current law. There are issues about Egypt that ought to be discussed on the floor. And when I hear my colleagues say, oh, these are sensitive issues, we shouldn't talk about them on the floor, then where should we talk about them? This is the appropriate bill to talk about those things, and yet many of these amendments were not made in order. That's why an open rule would have been more appropriate. And in terms of debate, I don't know why we have to limit debate on issues like the national security on the NSA down to 15 minutes apiece. Everybody's concerned about this. And again, I will just close, Mr. Speaker, by again urging my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question, so that we can offer an amendment to allow Mr. Van Hollen's language to be made in order. That the Republican leadership agreed to go to a conference with the Senate over the budget. This sequester and these budget numbers that you are bringing to the floor on these various appropriations bills are destructive. You are hurting this. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hurting this economy. This gamesmanship that my friends on the other side are playing is doing great damage to this country. We have to stop this. We have to be grown-ups here and do what we're supposed to do. And the most important thing that can happen right now, given the fact that there's only 16 legislative days left to the end of this fiscal year, is for my friends on the other side of the aisle to go to conference on the budget and work out a deal so that we don't have these devastating cuts that will impact every city and town in this country, that will throw tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people out of work, that will do further damage to our infrastructure. You know, national security means the quality of life that people have here in the United States. You know, it means about where they can have good health care and good education, where they have good roads and safe roads to drive on. It means where they have a job. National security begins right here at home. And the numbers that my Republican friends have been bringing to the floor in terms of allocations for these appropriations bills on domestic spending would be devastating to this economy. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question, and I urge a no vote on this rule. We should have an open rule where we can talk about all these major issues that are confronting our nation and the world. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the comments my friend from Massachusetts have made in a lot of areas, particularly as it relates to the open rule. But I do want to remind him, and I wasn't here in 2010, but you know, the Rules Committee at that point in time, and I know that my good friend sat on that committee, that Rules Committee made a determination in regards to a structured rule. And that structured rule only allowed for 16 amendments to come to the House floor. That structured rule locked out a lot of folks' ideas in regards to how to better the appropriation bill for the Department of Defense for the 2011 fiscal year. So while this rule may not be perfect, and I agree with my good friend that it's not perfect, but I do want to point out that it does make over 100 amendments in order that are going to be debated here on this floor. An amendment on Syria, an amendment on Egypt, 2 amendments on the NSA, which are appropriate to have a debate here. And as we talk about authorization, particularly as we look at the NSA, that debate's going to come up in a very robust way, because I truly believe that we need to have that. You know, as it relates to Syria, I have 3 sons that currently serve in the United States military. And the last thing I want to do is see us arm rebels, where my sons may have to face those arms at some point in time. I've had sons deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and as a member of this House, there are very few of us that have served in the military, and the same as relates to having our family members serve in harm's way. And so I take it very, very right to the heart that we want to make sure that we don't put our sons or daughters in any jeopardy, particularly as it relates to arming those that we have no idea who they are. And so I think I've said enough, but my position on arming the Syrian rebels, those that we don't even know who they are, or what we're doing in Egypt, or what's going on within the NSA as it relates to our civil liberties here in the United States as American citizens. We certainly are going to address those issues as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, I support this rule and encourage my colleagues to do as well. As a father of 3 sons in the military, I'm disappointed that we've gotten to this point where ideological factions had divided this House so deeply they were forced to put a structured rule in place in order to simply consider a bill that funds our Department of Defense. And just to note, you know, 2 years ago when we were having this discussion, I got a call from one of my sons who was deployed to Iraq, worried that his troopers were not going to get paid because that's what they were being told, because of actions of this House. And the last thing is, when our sons and daughters go off to fight, the last thing they should have to worry about is how they're going to take care of the car payment or feed their children back here at home. They should have one focus, and that's the fight ahead of them and returning back to their families and loved ones in the best possible condition they can be. To me, it's about as pathetic as it gets when we're putting these men and women are putting their lives on the line each day, and we're playing politics with our national defense. But we can't put differences aside long enough not to even agree to a funding bill, but just to agree that we should debate the funding bill at all. I wish we could have an open rule on both of these appropriation measures. You know I do. But when it comes to funding the Pentagon, when it comes to funding our military, the issue at hand is too important to leave this subject to the political whims of select members who could tie up the debate for days and end with irresponsible amendments that might ultimately put this nation and its citizens at risk, because that's why we're here. That's why we've taken the 3 most hot-button politicized issues and selected specific amendments to address each of these concerns, while still making in order every other amendment that would not be otherwise to a subject of a point of order. I welcome debate on how we need to change the laws of this land. I'm an active proponent in having it. Millions of Americans, including me, are questioning many of the laws right now, especially when it comes to the use of military force and the powers given to the NSA under the Patriot Act. It's clear. Those are conversations that must happen in this forum here. But we can't let it derail the basic funding of our troops, and that's what it comes down to. This bill cannot possibly give the issues at hand the justice they deserve. It's an imperfect tool, and the only 10 minutes of debate per amendment, it would cut short the conversations that we have. That is why, although it is a departure from the normal appropriation process, this resolution brings up H.R. 2397 under a structured rule. That said, the second half of the House Resolution 312 is proof that this House is still dedicated to the open process. We fulfill our promise to both our constituents and ourselves by providing an open rule on transportation and housing appropriations. It's a reminder to us that the defense bill is an example of extraordinary times calling for extraordinary measures. At the end of the day, what's most important is that we fulfill our core mission. And as anybody in the military will tell you, sometimes we have to adapt. It's not perfect, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, especially when we're talking about keeping our troops and our citizens safe. For that reason, I'm proud to support the rule, and I encourage all my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
All time having expired. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
On that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess for a period of less than 15 minutes.